Last week, we learned about regression discontinuity design, a powerful tool for causal inference even when we have unobservables and simultaneity bias present. However, regression discontinuity designs can't be applied to every single question that interests us. It requires a very specific setup with discontinuities linked to a running variable. This week, we'll look at another strategy for causal inference that can be used in a wider variety of circumstances, the instrumental variable strategy. For an example, let's say we're interested in the effects of smoking cigarettes during pregnancy on birth weight.
Would you give a cigarette to your unborn child? You do. Every time you smoke while you're pregnant. Pregnant mothers, please, don't smoke.
For obvious reasons, we can't answer this question using a randomized controlled trial, since it would require forcing the women in the treatment group to risk the health of their babies by smoking. An observational study would have its own problems, since there are likely a multitude of unobservables that are correlated with both a mother's choice to smoke during pregnancy and a baby's birth weight. So what could we do? One possibility is what's called an encouragement design. Let's say we have 200 pregnant women who are all smokers. We pick 100 of those women at random and give them each a pamphlet describing the dangers of smoking during pregnancy and a free 9-month supply of nicotine gum to help them quit. Then we follow them for the next 9 months. In the group that received the encouragement, let's say 40 women quit smoking, and in the group that didn't receive the encouragement, only 10 women quit smoking. We can then also observe that the encouraged group had babies that weighed, on average, 3,260 grams, and the non-encouraged group had babies with an average birth weight of 3,140 grams. So we can conclude that the encouragement increased birth weight by 120 grams. Remember our original research question, though. We're interested in the effects of smoking on birth weight, not the effects of encouragement on birth weight. So to really answer our research question, we need to calculate the effect of encouragement on smoking. We calculate that encouragement reduced smoking prevalence by 30 percentage points. If we then divide the effect of encouragement on birth weight, 120 grams, by the effect of encouragement on smoking, 30 percentage points, then we can estimate the effect of smoking on birth weight to be 400 grams. The encouragement we gave is an example of what we call an instrumental variable. Since our independent variable of interest, smoking during pregnancy, is highly endogenous, we use another variable that we know is exogenous and correlated with our variable of interest. Since we randomly assigned the encouragement to women in the study, we know that encouragement isn't correlated with any other confounding variables, so we can use it as an instrument for our endogenous variable, smoking. The first relationship we examined was between the instrumental variable, encouragement, and the independent or endogenous variable, smoking. We call this the first stage. We then found the relationship between the instrumental variable and the dependent variable, birth weight, called the reduced form. If we divide the reduced form estimate by the first stage estimate, we get an estimate of the causal effect of smoking on birth weight, called the second stage. To put this in context of regression, if y is our dependent variable, x is our endogenous independent variable, and z is our instrument, then the coefficient in this regression will be equal to the first stage effect, the coefficient in this regression will be equal to the reduced form effect, and we could take this quotient to find the second stage effect. Another way to obtain the second stage would be to regress the dependent variable on the fitted values from the first stage regression. This process for estimating causal effects by way of an instrumental variable is called two-stage least squares estimation. Now, our encouragement design was a case where the researchers created their own instrumental variable through a randomized trial, but it's possible to use two-stage least squares with observational data too. All we have to do is find some variable z that is correlated with x, but not with any other confounding variables. So what exactly makes an instrumental variable? Well, if we want to use variable z as an instrument for variable x, then there are three main criteria that have to be met. The first is the independence assumption, which states that z must be statistically independent from potential outcomes. Another way of saying this is that z is as good as randomly assigned. Some instrumental variables satisfy this assumption by actually being randomly assigned. For example, a person could be randomly selected through the draft to join the military, or a student could win a lottery to attend a charter school. Other times, researchers use instrumental variables that aren't actually assigned by random lottery, but are still uninfluenced by social phenomena. The best example of this is what has become one of the most popular instrumental variables, the level of rainfall that an area receives in a year. Rainfall isn't random, of course, meteorologists can predict it before it happens, but the factors that lead to higher rainfall on a particular day don't have a causal relationship with most variables that social scientists are interested in. The next criteria that must be met for Z to be an instrument for X is called the exclusion restriction. For Z to be a valid instrument to estimate X's effect on Y, Z can only affect Y through its effect on X. So, for example, the exclusion restriction is satisfied in this causal graph and violated in this causal graph. If there are any other mechanisms by which your instrumental variable might influence your dependent variable, then the exclusion restriction is being violated, and our ability to interpret the results of two-stage least squares causally is thrown into question. Finally, there's the assumption of strict monotonicity. For this assumption, think back to our example of our encouragement design with smoking during pregnancy. There are 4 possible types of people in that experiment. The first group are called always takers. These are the women who would quit smoking regardless of whether they were given the encouragement pamphlet or not. The next group is never takers. These are the women who would continue to smoke even if they were given the encouragement pamphlet. Next, we have the compliers. These are women who are convinced to quit smoking because they received the pamphlets and gum. The final possible group are the defiers. Women who would quit smoking if they were in the control group, but change their mind and decide to continue smoking after they're given the pamphlet and gum. If that sounds really weird, then that's good news, because the strict monotonicity assumption means that we assume that there are no defiers. If instrumental variable Z increases X for some individuals and decreases X for other individuals, then we have both compliers and defiers in our sample, the strict monotonicity assumption is violated, and we can't use Z as an instrument for X. If all of these assumptions are met, then two-stage least squares will identify what's called the local average treatment effect. The local average treatment effect is the average treatment effect for the compliers group. This distinction means that even if all of the assumptions underlying instrumental variable estimation have been met, results from two-stage least squares may not be externally valid. We may not be able to generalize them to populations beyond the compliers. In general, the more heterogeneous the treatment effect is across individuals, the more important the distinction between the average treatment effect and the local average treatment effect becomes. In cases where the treatment effect doesn't vary at all across individuals, then the ATE and the LATE will be equal. Let's look into a different use of instrumental variables. Does being placed into foster care lead children into juvenile delinquency?
Whoa, would you look at this place?
Sink full of dirty dishes, trash not taken out, living room a mess, stacks of old newspapers from 20 years ago.
Get ready, gamblers, for the World Series of Dog Racing. What the heck? A disheveled and malnourished man found sleeping in his own filth seems confused and dehydrated.
Where's the baby?
Well, that's her, ain't it? Kids love that water.
Oh, my Lord!
Stupid babies need the most attention.
Children, where are your parents?
I don't know. They should be here.
Yes, they should be here. Those parents better have a good excuse.
Oh, I love getting away from this dump.
It's like I'm on some wonderful drug. What's going on here?
Child welfare, ma'am.
Here's a little bedtime reading.
Squalid hellhole. Toilet paper hung in improper overhand fashion. Dogs mating on dining room table. What are you doing with my children?
We're taking them where you can't get them.
What? No. No, you can't. I won't let you.
Mrs. Simpson, restrain yourself or you'll be arrested.
Now just relax, kids. All we're doing is taking you to a foster home.
Hey, Leo, welcome to your new home, Neglectorinos.
If we perform a raw comparison, about 60% of children placed into foster care are arrested before they turn 18, compared to only 20% of children in the general population. So the simple difference in means is a staggering 40 percentage points, or 200%. However, by now you should realize the selection problem at work here. Children who enter into foster care are disproportionately likely to experience abuse and neglect, and to come from disadvantaged backgrounds. If we could choose children at random to place into foster care, we could more easily identify the causal effect of foster care on juvenile delinquency. Economist Joseph Doyle had a more ethical idea using instrumental variables. Doyle used a sample of about 8,000 cases of reported child neglect or abuse from Cook County, Illinois. When Cook County receives a report of child abuse or neglect, it assigns an investigator to the case. Which investigator gets assigned which case is, for all intents and purposes, random. Investigators also have a great deal of influence over which children are removed from their home and placed into foster care. They can decide that the complaint they received is unsubstantiated, which immediately ends the investigation, or they can decide to immediately remove the child from the home in emergency situations. Between these two extremes, the investigator also presents evidence and makes recommendations to a child protection judge. Since investigators have to use their own judgment, some investigators will be more reluctant to place children into foster care than others, while others will be stricter and more willing to remove children from their homes. Due to this variability, cases that are assigned stricter investigators are basically encouraged into foster care, like in our framework earlier. The type of investigator that is randomly assigned to a case should make an excellent instrumental variable for being placed into foster care. The independence and exclusion restriction assumptions are likely being met. Doyle calculated the foster care placement rate for all 409 investigators in the dataset, and then created a binary variable equal to 1 if the investigator in case I had a placement rate above the median. This binary variable is his instrumental variable. It indicates that case I was assigned an investigator who is more willing to remove a child from their home and place them into foster care. So now we need to run the first stage regression. We regress our endogenous variable on our instrument. In this case, we regress this binary variable, which indicates that case I ended with a foster care placement, on our instrument. We can see that the results from the first stage, that cases assigned a stricter investigator were 9.2 percentage points more likely to end in a foster care placement. Now, for the second stage, we take our dependent variable, which equals 1 if the child from case I was arrested before age 18, and regress it on the fitted values from the first stage, which gives us this result. Alternatively, we could calculate the reduced form model, where we regress our measure of delinquency on our instrument, which gives us this result, and then divide the coefficient from the first stage by the coefficient from the reduced form to get the same coefficient from the second stage. We can see from our second stage that foster care placement increases the probability that a youth is arrested by about 14 percentage points, which is much smaller than our 40 percentage point naive estimate, but is still a significant adverse effect of foster care placement. So does this mean that foster care is universally bad for children? Not necessarily. This example is particularly good for seeing the difference between the average treatment effect and the local average treatment effect. Remember, instrumental variable estimation only identifies the treatment effect on the compliers. Which individuals are in each group in our foster care example? Well, the never takers are individuals that neither strict nor lenient investigators would choose to place in foster care. Both types of investigators would agree that never takers are better off staying with their family. The always takers are the opposite. Both types of investigators agree that always takers should be taken away from their families and placed into foster care. These are probably the most extreme cases of neglect and abuse. The final group, since we're assuming that defiers don't exist, are the compliers. The complier group consists of cases that are on the border, cases that lenient investigators think should stay with their families, and strict investigators think should be taken away. What Doyle's results tell us is that foster care has negative impacts for these compliers. We might conclude that it would be better if they remained with their families. However, it doesn't follow that it would be better for groups like the always takers to remain with their families, since that group consists of the children in the most dire circumstances. Okay, let's look at one more research question using instrumental variables. Let's go back to a classic, the effect of education on earnings. We've discussed previously how the omitted impact of ability makes it difficult to estimate the causal effect of education on earnings, so this seems like a problem crying out for an instrumental variable. Well, in the 1990s, Josh Angrist and Alan Kruger used one, quarter of birth. Angrist and Kruger noticed in their data that men with birthdays earlier in the year obtained less education than those born later in the year. Why? Well, they argue that since most states at the time required that students start school in the autumn of the calendar year in which they turn 6 and stay in school until their 16th birthday, students born earlier in the year will start school when they're closer to 7 years old and will turn 16 and thus be able to drop out of school earlier than other students in their cohort. So, if we want to use quarter of birth as an instrument for years of education, the first stage regression looks like this. We regress years of education on these indicator variables for birthdays in each quarter of a year. Then we obtain the fitted values of education from the first stage and then estimate the second stage by regressing wages on the fitted values from the first stage. For the sake of comparison, Angrist and Kruger also run this regression examining the base relationship between wages and years of education without using any instrumental variable. Their results ended up looking like this. Notice that the two-stage least squares estimate in each specification is close to or even higher than the regular OLS estimate. This should seem really surprising to us. Why? Well, the entire reason we thought we needed to use an instrumental variable in the first place was because we expected OLS to give us faulty results due to ability bias. There are only two possibilities here. Either we were wrong about ability bias, and the correlation between wages and education really is a good estimate for the causal effect, or season of birth is a flawed instrument. Looking at our criteria for a good instrumental variable, are any of the assumptions that are critical to use of instrumental variables being violated? Well, for the exclusion restriction to be satisfied, we need to know that an individual's season of birth doesn't affect earnings in any way other than by reducing their education. After the publication of Angrist and Kruger's research, economists Casey Buckles and Daniel Hungerman point out that higher socioeconomic status women are disproportionately likely to plan their child's birth in the spring, fall, and summer, and avoid having a baby in the winter, causing babies born in the winter to be disproportionately born to teenage, unmarried, and poorly educated mothers. This opens up numerous channels aside from education for the season of a person's birth to affect income, violating the exclusion restriction. If lower income mothers disproportionately give birth in the first quarter of the year, then quarter of birth affects both education and ability, and the two-stage least squares estimates are just as biased as the OLS estimates. This example hopefully demonstrates that while instrumental variables can be very powerful for identifying causal effects, they are by no means unassailable. It only takes a single overlooked connection between your instrument and a confounding variable to throw your entire research design into question.